lot of videos on their website that show exactly how to rinse books, exactly how to do things. So it is they're YouTube videos. I mean, you can sit there and play them and stop them and look at them as much as you want, and that's really, really useful. Does anyone else have any other questions from any of the other sites?
Okay, this is Miriam, and we're back up in Jacksonville. It was mostly the laptop that lost the signal. So I do want to remind people, because I got asked on the side if we could leave the slide with the web links back up. I do want to remind everybody that these webinar presentations are being recorded, and they will be available as recordings as well as just the PowerPoint itself. So if you want to go back to just one slide, you don't have to listen to the whole recording on the online community. Thanks very much, Françoise. That was a really informative presentation. And we're now looking forward to Stephanie Hornbeck's presentation. And Stephanie is a conservator who worked with the Smithsonian, and while she was at the Smithsonian was on the disaster and recovery team that went to Haiti. And for her, what I understand was pretty extraordinary work there. Stephanie earned some pretty high awards and honors from the Secretary of the Smithsonian. So we're really delighted to welcome Stephanie Hornbeck to the webinar, and I'm going to turn the microphone over to Stephanie for our next presentation. Thanks, Stephanie.
Thank you very much, Miriam. Today I'll present the initial response and salvage steps of collection staff to protect inorganic and organic objects and textiles before professional conservators are involved in the recovery efforts. If your institution does have a conservator on staff, or you have a contract conservator with whom you work, conservators should be involved in the early stages of salvage efforts to guide the response and recovery of collection items. After a disaster, which could be man-made or natural, such as floods or leaks, severe storms, hurricanes, fires, or earthquakes, the first 48 to 72 hours are very important. These early hours will involve mainly first responders, such as the fire department, followed by both facilities experts and conservators and collections managers. The early hours and days following disaster are chaotic, so preparation prior to an actual disaster is essential. Ideally, collection staff will already be versed in emergency response, and the various personnel in their respective responsibilities will have been identified in advance. A stockpile of supplies will have been gathered, and a list of relevant vendor contact names and numbers compiled. Ideally, a relationship with the local fire department will have already been established so that they will understand the diversity of collection materials and their sensitivity to response methods. And this step is critical, as first responders will be the first to enter a disaster site, and their response actions can complicate the salvage and recovery of collection items, particularly if water and/or high water pressure are used in response. While waiting to enter a disaster site, which can take days, use the time to contact conservators to review emergency response plans, to gather supplies, materials, and equipment, to review salvage protocols by material type, to gather collection records. And if electricity is down, it will be important to have generators up and running to power air conditioning, fans, dehumidifiers, and lights. After first responders finish their response and inspections and have determined that the facility is safe, essential collection personnel will be allowed to enter the building. It is important not to enter the disaster site until the official okay has been given. No matter the importance of particular collection items, human safety is the most important consideration during the entire salvage and response period. It is imperative that staff wear appropriate personal protective equipment, or PPE. These may include Tyvek suits, sleeves and caps, gloves and particle masks, or respirators. Soot particles from a fire and mold spores from water damage can be very harmful to humans. So one of the first steps to take before any work begins on object salvage is the collection of samples of soot or mold from a variety of surfaces using swabs. Inform the fire department about what kinds of materials burned in the fire, such as insulation, drywall, plastic, etc., and ask for guidance on protection. Samples of mold should be sent to a mycologist, a biologist who specializes in the identification of fungi. The mycologist will be able to describe methods for effective mold removal and safe precautions for human health and safety. Collection cleaning operations will likely happen simultaneously with building cleaning and reconstruction efforts. Precautions should be taken for large movable objects and displays before moving to movable artifacts. If necessary, large display areas and galleries can be barricaded off with plywood to protect them during building cleaning. Immovable large individual objects and displays should be covered with polyethylene sheeting. Before beginning the collection object cleaning operations, ask the building cleaning service to prepare several rooms to be designated as clean rooms. These rooms will be used for collections processing and temporary storage of treated objects. Ideally, a clean room will have close proximity to a washroom with a sink with running water. Similarly, quarantine rooms should be established for objects with the greatest amount of mold to prevent spread and contamination of other objects. Electric air sterilizers can be used to purify the air. Objects with active infestation should also be quarantined. Affected objects should be wrapped in plastic to isolate them. The clean rooms will need to be outfitted with furniture and equipment for work. You will need tables, shelves, fans, dehumidifiers, and possibly air sterilizers and chest freezers. You will also need hygrothermographs or data loggers, canister vacuums, a supply of secondary supports like boards and trays to support and carry objects and textiles, ethafoam, polyethylene plastic, and a supply of absorbent materials like towels, water, non-inked newsprint, etc. Importantly, a daily cleaning regimen should be implemented to treat work surfaces with 70% isopropyl alcohol at the end of each day. Before any collection salvage begins, it is important to tour the site and to describe in writing a summary of the damage to various collections by material type. The presence of mold should be noted. The temperature and relative humidity should be noted. Priorities should be noted based on the vulnerability of materials to deterioration if left untreated. In the case of fire damage, all organic materials and porous inorganics like low-fired ceramics, plasters, and light-colored large-grained stones like marble are the most vulnerable to soot staining. In general, in the case of water damage, all organic materials and metals are the most vulnerable collection types. It is important to photograph the site, including exhibition galleries and collection storage, and examples of affected objects before salvage begins. And in the interest of time, images may need to be limited to diagnostic examples of damage, rather than undertaking record shots of each individual object. Written documentation will take the form of reports, as well as artifact forms in a checklist format for speed for each work treated, and written salvage and recovery procedures posted at workstations. site is secure and the environment is stable, undamaged objects should be left in place, covered in polyethylene sheeting, or moved to temporary storage. And attention should focus first on damaged collection items. Be aware that damaged materials will be fragile. Materials that have been exposed to heat and soot from fire can be embrittled and have fragile surfaces. Materials that are wet are heavier and can be structurally weak and or have fragile surfaces. Use secondary supports like boards, trays, and boxes whenever possible. If you find broken objects, collect all of the pieces, and if they are dry, keep them together in a clear polyethylene container or bag. We'll now proceed to salvage techniques, starting with fire incidents. Fires of any size can emit a tremendous amount of smoke, especially the fires in rooms fitted with fire retardant materials, such as insulation, which emit large amounts of soot. Soot removal will take up the bulk of recovery time following a museum fire. It is important that you inform the fire department about the materials that burn so that they can advise on any dangers related to soot composition. Soot is a heterogeneous mixture of carbonized materials. It becomes more difficult to remove over time, and because it is acidic, it is important to remove it quickly. Collection objects should be prioritized for salvage and treatment by object material and its sensitivity to soot damage. Objects with charred areas and or structural damage are the most unstable and should be given first priority. These priorities then follow. Organic materials are more sensitive than inorganic materials. Porous surfaces are more sensitive than non-porous. Intricate surfaces are more sensitive than smooth surfaces. And light-colored materials, such as white marble, pale feathers, etc., will show staining more than dark materials. Vacuuming is a critical step that must take place during salvage of fire-damaged materials. The greatest degree of removal is accomplished if vacuuming is taken in situ, before the object is touched, packed, or moved. To avoid soot transfer, it is essential to vacuum the object as found without moving it. For example, folded textiles should remain folded. Vacuuming should begin with surfaces and then proceed to crevices and folds. Portable canister vacuums with a long hose, crevice tool, and micro attachments should be used. Attachments will require frequent cleaning with alcohol to avoid soot transfer. High-efficiency particle air, or HEPA filters, for the vacuum are recommended. Handling should be minimized during both response and recovery phases. After vacuuming in situ, objects should be carried as they were found. For example, again, textiles should not be unfolded, or documents should not be separated. Direct pressure during handling should be avoided by using carrying boards and trays. The successful salvage of soot-covered objects should attempt to minimize pressure, disruption, and dispersion of the soot layer, all of which tend to drive the soot further into the surface of the object. Where possible, use the vacuum attachments without the use of dusting brushes or screens, which can drive the soot in. The vacuum attachment should be held just above the object and not touch it. After the vacuuming stage, further soot removal will be necessary. It is important to use dry methods only. Textured soot sponges and polyurethane makeup sponges are good for this purpose. Swipe, do not rub the sponge across the surface, and the sponges come in different sizes, which can be cut into smaller pieces as needed. It is important that temporary storage conditions be dry, as moisture can activate acidic components of the soot, rendering staining more intractable. After noting any labeling information, housing materials should be discarded and replaced with clean, dry materials. If temporary storage is located in the building at the fire site, loosely cover storage units and shelving with polyethylene. Vents in the room should be covered as well so that soot is not transferred from other areas of the building via ductwork. Now we'll move to salvage techniques after a water incident. After a water-related disaster, the main issues to address will be elimination of excess water and then control of mold. Before moving to object salvage, early efforts should be directed at elimination of excess water and stabilizing environmental conditions first. Be aware that the water may be dirty and deposit mud or particulates on objects. The ambient relative humidity will have to be brought below 60% to arrest the growth and spread of mold. In moving to salvage of individual items, the order of priority is determined by the inherent fragility of the materials, their condition, and their susceptibility to damage by water. In general, the priorities are organics first, in this order: botanical and plant materials, leather and skin, textiles, wood, and then the category of bone, antler, horn, ivory, shell. Salvage then moves on to inorganics in this order: unstable metals, non-glazed ceramics, glazed ceramics and glass, untreated metal, and stone. The general process will be to remove dirt, remove excess water, and air dry slowly. And we'll now talk about techniques by material category. We'll start with organic materials, moving from more vulnerable to more stable. If wet organic materials cannot be addressed within 48 hours, they should be frozen. Freezing buys time until the objects can be addressed, arrests mold formation, keeps inks and dyes from migrating, and avoids deformation from drying. Wrap the object or textile tightly in polyethylene plastic, tape closed, and freeze at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Chest freezers, freezing vaults, or freezing trucks are options, depending on the volume of works to freeze. Do not freeze ivory, shell, or horn until you have consulted a conservator about these materials. I'll briefly touch on a method called freeze drying, which is also known as lyophilization. It's a method for conserving waterlogged leather. The leather is immersed in a polyethylene glycol to prevent shrinkage, which displaces the water. Then the object is frozen to -20 to -30 degrees centigrade. Then the freeze-dried leather is placed under vacuum for up to 2 to 4 weeks. And this method is mainly used if you have a very high volume of waterlogged leather to address. Untanned skins like rawhide and semi-tanned materials like buckskin will need to be carefully manipulated during drying to retain flexibility. Pat out to correct shape with absorbent materials and change materials as they become saturated. Begin air drying within 48 hours at less than 60% relative humidity to prevent mold growth. Semi-tanned leather, rawhide, and weak leather, as leathers affected by red rot, will be irreversibly stiffened and darkened if not treated quickly. And these images show a semi-tanned Apache shirt that was exposed to a severe leak, causing mold and infestation to develop, as you see on the left. It was dried out without manipulation, and it darkened, shrank, and hardened with wrinkles, as you see on the right. Moving to textiles, wet textiles will be heavier and more fragile when wet than when dry. so only handle them as necessary, and always use secondary supports like trays or screens, or a sling made from cotton muslin or screening material to support the textile. Address textiles with running dyes first. If colors begin to run, stop immediately and blot the running color carefully. Do not continue with water treatment. If necessary, use a portable hairdryer set to low heat to dry the areas with running dyes. Use absorbent materials to absorb the excess water. Cover the textile with open weave cloth like cheesecloth and allow to air dry with fans. If colors are stable, gently wash off wet, dirt, or mud with running water or in a basin. Always use nylon screening to support the object, and soft brushes can help to dislodge dirt. If textiles are in good structural condition, blot, but do not rub them, with towels or other absorbent material. Keep changing the materials until the textile is damp, and remove any wet housing materials like tissues and padding. As the textiles dry, gently unfold them if they were folded. Costume accessories like hats and shoes and three-dimensional baskets may require internal padding to retain their forms while they dry out. While lightly damp, pad out costumes and accessories with tissue, nylon tulle, or polyester batting to speed up drying, and the padding will need to be regularly replaced as it absorbs moisture. With the exception of archaeological textiles, quick drying is preferable for textiles. A lot of space will be needed to dry them, as they need to be dried flat in a single layer without stacking. Clean floors can be used if necessary. Cover the work surfaces with polyethylene sheeting and blotter paper. Wet textiles that are on hangers should be placed in a horizontal orientation to dry, and orient fans to blow across the textiles. Wood is vulnerable to damage by water and the drying out process. Joints may separate, veneers lift, and old repairs may come apart. Water can soften or lift finishes. Fast drying can cause irreversible damage like cracks, splits, and warpage. Drawers and compartments on furniture will stick, and these should be opened slightly, and wet liners should be removed. Polychrome wood objects require immediate conservation assistance. Do not brush or rinse polychrome works, as the paint surface is fragile and may separate from the wood as the wood absorbs and desorbs water. Wood objects that are not painted can be blotted with absorbent materials like blotter paper and non-inked newspaper. Remove mud and dirt with a moist sponge and use a soft bristle brush to clean carvings. Remove any cushions from furniture and allow to dry completely before replacing them. Slow drying of wooden objects is important. Raise the objects onto pallets or 2x4 planks to allow air circulation. Blot off excess water. Wrap the object in blotter paper and then wrap it in polyethylene sheeting to slow down the drying time. If bone, ivory, horn, or shell objects are wet, they can be gently rinsed with ethyl alcohol. However, do not introduce water if the object is dry. These types of objects are vulnerable to cracking and delamination during the drying process. So slow down drying, as for wood, by wrapping in polyethylene plastic. We'll move to inorganic materials now. These include metals, ceramics, stone, glass, and plaster. Gently wash off wet dirt and mud from metals, high-fire ceramics, and fine-grained stones with running water or in a basin. You can sponge with clean water and damp brushes to remove the mud. And glass can be sponged with a water and alcohol mixture. It's important not to leave glass wet, and it should not be immersed. Do not wash porous stones, weak plasters, unfired or low-fired ceramics, or any medium with surface paint or fragile surfaces, such as those exhibiting delamination or network cracking. Fragile inorganic materials include archaeological metals, actively corroding metals, heavily mineralized surfaces, and unstable surfaces, such as those exhibiting cracking or lifting. Address these materials within 48 hours. Absorb the excess water with absorbent materials and dry them out, and use desiccants as needed. Copper alloys in particular should be packed in silica gel. And metals with textile or leather pseudomorphs should be kept damp as found until a conservator can treat them. Both organic and inorganic objects should be air dried. It is preferable to undertake air drying indoors. Use ceiling or floor fans, and objects should not be placed in close proximity to the fans. Heat should be avoided. If indoor spaces are not possible, drying can happen outside, though it needs to happen out of direct sunlight, as under a tented shelter. Raise objects on screens or supports to allow air circulation. Wet textiles and leather should be dried horizontally on slatted supports or screens. Absorbent packing materials should be changed frequently as they become water saturated. As ceramics, glass, and stone dry out, check them for the development of efflorescence. Efflorescence is the crystallization of salts that can cause serious structural damage. Efflorescence looks like white frost or needle-like forms. Notify conservators for assistance in dealing with these types of objects. If mold develops, follow the instructions described earlier. And once the object or textile is dry, the mold should be removed by a vacuum fitted with a HEPA filter. The combination of a moist, dark environment and organic materials will eventually cause infestation. So early steps to eliminate excess water, facilitate air circulation, and air drying are important. If an infestation does develop, isolate affected organic materials to contain the infestation. Wrap infested organic materials tightly in polyethylene and freeze at 4 degrees Fahrenheit. The extreme conditions that disasters cause to collection materials can result in irreversible damage. Collection items will be left in weak and altered states. During this vulnerable time, it is important that recovery methods improve the conditions of the objects and not cause further damage. Personal health and safety are important, and personal protective equipment should be worn. During the recovery period, conduct regular short training sessions by material type and post stepwise procedures by material type at workstations to remind everyone of the necessary precautions to take and methods to use. Be mindful of exceptions, such as fragile surfaces, to protocols. Keeping the workspace clean, disinfected, and dry is very important. If possible, before stabilizing objects and textiles, consult with conservators to guide your efforts. I'm listing a few online resources here. The American Institute for Conservation has a team of specially trained conservators who respond to emergencies, and they have a 24-hour call line if you do have a disaster. Also, if you need to find a conservator by specialty or geographic location, the AIC should be contacted as well. Heritage Preservation is a very helpful site and has a lot of useful information about responding to disasters. And lastly, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, also has some very useful information that can be adapted to cultural institutions. Some online resources that have useful how-to instructions are the National Park Service, Conservagrams, and the Minnesota Historical Society Conservation Notes. These are usually single-page documents that very quickly outline by material type the steps to take in the salvage procedures. They're very useful. Here are some vendors of archival materials and supplies. And lastly, I want to thank you and let you know to please feel free to contact me with any questions that you may have related to your collections. Thank you.
Hi everyone. I wanted to jump in real quick. This is Robin down in South Florida, and to see if anyone had any questions for Stephanie.
Okay, this is Miriam. Thanks, Robin, for jumping in. Not sure what happened there. There are not questions for Stephanie, I don't think, here in Jacksonville. I'm looking around the room. But I have to say that on the one hand, that was an incredibly clear and helpful presentation on the part of both Stephanie and Françoise. But I think if I look around the room here, a little overwhelming at the same time. This is a huge amount of information for us to hold in our head. So I think that sending us to the resources so that when we are faced with the moment of salvage, we have some resources on hand and some websites that we've looked at to get some information.
We have a quick question down here in South Florida about freeze drying. If Stephanie could speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Freeze drying is used primarily for waterlogged leather. It's also used for documents and books, and it's undertaken if you have just a very large volume of materials to address. It will buy you time, and large volumes can be treated at once, like in a large vault, or sometimes there are trucks that are used. But it's not necessary to follow the procedures for freeze drying. If you have just a few items, you can deal with them individually. It's really more for mass volumes of certain things.
What about makeshift freezers? Like if you've got a collection that you can't get to right away, you said maybe chest freezers, how you can use those, and like how long you can keep the items in there.
Okay, we had a question here in South Florida about freezers and makeshift freezers. Well, ideally you want to use a freezer that can get down to 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is going to usually be a chest freezer like for meat, for example. You can use something like an ice cream truck, like a large ice cream truck, not like your little ice cream truck in your neighborhood, or a walk-in freezer. But the main thing is you need the temperature to get low enough. And if you're freezing to buy time, they can be frozen indefinitely. If you're freezing for infestation, it's usually frozen at very low temperature for a short period of time, about a week, as a treatment. So these are two different applications of freezing.